Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about how straight white males are held to a much higher standard. This is particularly in working middle class type situations, to a much higher standard than minority groups. By minorities, I mean everyone other than straight white males. So this sort of needs a closer look, and just now it could be educational, it could be professional in the workplace, it could be in legal situations. At any time, it's very hard to see or not to agree with the premise that straight white males are held to a much higher standard than everyone else. Now, how long has this been going on for? It's become a bigger issue, I guess, more recently as equity, diversity, and inclusion, which is very much a central part of the globalist, shtick to replace white people, or at least to make white people a minority in all white countries, and force it on them without their consent, by the way. But this goes back sort of a while here, and I'm looking at even sort of in the earlier 20th century. So Europeans in Africa or elsewhere around the world, there are various notes, and if you dig around, you can find them, various papers or letters going between, say, executives in a mining company or an engineering company or something like that, where they're talking about how to use the local workers, because it's quite expensive to bring Europeans over to do all the work. So you can see they'd rather not, just from an economics viewpoint, but then they look at how reliable the local people are, and they're saying even if you take them over to England, for example, to study, to be a technician or engineer or a maintenance person, maintaining equipment and that sort of thing. Even if you do that, they're still too unreliable. They still have to be directly supervised by white supervisors. So the letters say, well, look, you're just going to have to accept a lower standard from these people. And even though you may not be completely happy with it, to put them in these positions, you're going to have to accept that lower standard if you want these people to have anything to do with the operation, as in the technology of the operation and the higher levels of administration and so on. Now, there's a lot of talk about, if you give them something simple to do, point them at it and then come back and check on them, but you can do that. So there's an acceptance that there'll be a lower standard of work. Now, you find this all over, we're certainly wherever the Europeans were involved, you find this all over, and I didn't detect in the writing any tone of what today we would call racism or white supremacy or anything like that. It was the hard practical thing of, can you give these people a job to do? Will it be done reliably? Yes or no? It was just that. And the conclusion was that, other than in some rare cases, it was hard to find people who were reliable. But they would also, in letters, and you'd see something mentioned like, they'd mention one person who was who was reliable, a local native who was reliable, and so they would praise them accordingly. But again, there was no hint of they're no good because they're black or something. That you didn't see that. They would just say they're no good, and we've had 100 black people who haven't been any good, and therefore there's an association. But it's behavioural, not racist based, not race based. It's purely behavioural based, and it's something that we really need to discuss today and push back against these ridiculous and absurd ideological fanatical claims of racism. But coming now to the late 1960s and 1970s, and say using England as an example, now there'd been not a lot, but quite a bit of immigration coming into England from, say, the Caribbean islands and the Indian subcontinent. So, from Pakistan, India, and so on. Now, the view at the time was that these people were coming from a third world country that had a much lower standard of education. It was very corrupt, very lazy by European standards. And so if these people were going to be given employment, they had to be given simpler jobs and less was expected of them. And so it was openly stated in and this caused some concern at the time. There were some white activist groups, and again, they're besmirched these days as they're all Hitler. But they were arguing that why should white people be held to a higher standard in examinations and testing and interview rigor and this sort of thing. And why were straight white males held to a higher standard when all other groups were held to a lower standard? You even see this in education. So in the British education system, there were papers going around that don't expect, because more and more girls were deciding to stay on in education at the time. Something that was encouraged by the centre-left parties, and yet papers were circulating that now more girls are in the education system. We have to soft mark them. We have to soft grade them, because if we grade them and examine their papers to the same standard that the straight white male or the white males are held to, then a lot of the girls will fail, and this will discourage them, and then they won't want to stay on, because girls don't like to be judged. They're happy to be sort of judged emotionally, so they can juggle all that around and play the relationship card. But in terms of strictly pass or fail, even back then, and still today, by the way, girls don't like to be judged on pass or fail type situations, which is what examinations are. So there was even papers going around the British education establishment back then saying, look, go easy on the girls, don't mark them so hard, give them some, and there were silly suggestions there, like give girls out of 100, give them 10% for just putting their name on the paper, and silly things like that. But white boys weren't given any breaks like that, and the same goes for people coming, black and brown people, that they were to be given special dispensations so that they didn't have to meet the same standard that the white boys did. There are even papers saying, around saying that even when we lower the standards, the black and brown people and the girls still can't match the boys. So, and you can see a growing movement there, and a growing ideology that was the embryo of equal outcomes. So it was the beginning of, if we don't have equal outcomes, then we must have a problem. Therefore, we must address the problem by creating equal outcomes. Now, they tried, I think, in a few ways. It looked like there was a few schools or sporadic and quite patchy efforts to say, well, why don't we try and raise the black and brown people and the girls up to the same standard as the boys? But that was deemed as just being too difficult. The raw material was too hard to work with. It was going to take too long. And it was a bad look, putting heavier pressure on these people. Because in order to get the equal outcomes through natural means, that is, all the minorities passed the tests and exams to the same standard of the white guy. In order to do that, they had to put added pressure on the minorities and sort of treat them much more harshly. And why didn't you arrive on time for class? Why aren't you staying back for extra studies? And they would have to treat them much more harshly in order to achieve the equal outcome. So they decided that back then, you can see it. Oh no, we can't treat them more harshly. No, we can't give them a more disciplined situation. No, we can't do that. Why don't we just give them a pass? Why don't we just give them 100 out of 100? Just say they got 100, and then that'll create the equal outcomes. So you could see that beginning, and if you follow the logic of ideological fanatics and all doctrinaire morons in that space, you can see how that pattern of logic would have played out and extrapolated over time, which indeed it did. And we've got the situation we have today of equal outcomes is now anything other than equal outcomes is fascist, Nazi, bigot, Hitler, racist, da da da. So, but now, looking back at the time, and I'm going back to a time I went to quite an upmarket private school in primary school days. This was my grandparents were quite well-to-do and or somewhat well-to-do, and they sent me to this school for a while. And the view in the school was they had an equal outcomes view, but this is how it plays out from the other end of the telescope. Their equal outcome, they're all white kids, by the way. The equal outcome view was that nobody would fail. Everybody would pass the test, which is that's about as close to equal outcomes as you can manage. Not everyone will get the exact same mark, of course, or grade. But now, so they took that view and they were absolutely brutal in its application. And now I was quite I wouldn't say I was an excellent student, but a good student. So I wasn't really affected by this because I kind of passed most of the tests and answered the questions in class and that sort of thing. But not that I didn't get clobbered a couple of times. I did, but the view was everybody would pass. So what the teachers did, and this was today they get sent to prison for this, but back in the day, which by the way wasn't that long ago, which shows you how quickly things have changed. The teachers were quite brutal. So their view was if you were failing tests, it was because you weren't concentrating, you weren't trying hard enough, you weren't studying hard enough, you weren't focusing on it. And if they could get you to focus and get you to work harder, then you would pass. That was the sort of the general view, which to some extent was inaccurate. Remember, we're talking kids here that are under 10 years old. Say I don't know, between 8 and 9, 10 years old, that sort of thing. So it was quite brutal. If you didn't answer a question, the teacher would, or master as they called them in those days, would walk around and would just hit random students with a question. It could be anything. What did a phrase in Latin mean, or 69 times 73, and you had to be quick. You couldn't go, let me think about this and scratch your bum. You had to be pretty quick in the response. And if you didn't get it, they used to give you the cane, just one hit with the cane. Now today that seems like, holy crap, that is way over the top. They must have all been Nazis. But it wasn't that at all. They just didn't. They believed that they could get every student to pass. So that was a way of achieving equal outcomes. Nobody would fail. And if we've got to beat the crap out of you to make sure you pass, then we'll do it. And I don't recall any parents complaining about that. But maybe they did. I don't know. But I remember my sort of comments, when I got home that I got clobbered today. Sometimes I thought they were just a little bit too trigger happy with the clobbering, but looking at the poetry that I had to memorize and the Latin I had to memorize, even going back that time, I still remember it and could still recite it. Recite it on demand. So it must have worked, at least in my case. But that was a way of achieving equal outcomes. But it's brutal. Now imagine there were a few kids there that were really dumb, and but I think just thinking back to a child's perception here, but just thinking back to one of them, I think he had some serious learning difficulties elsewhere. I don't know, but the assumption was he could be made to pass the test, and they got quite brutal with him, I thought. And as a kid, I looked at them, no, you're not going about this the right way. And I was a kid. I mean, surely they would have seen that. But again, the focus was everybody will pass, and that's how they went about it. The reverse is the case now, of course, where if you've got a number of minorities and they're really slow and they don't turn up, they come late, and they're disruptive in class, they don't give a shit, and that sort of thing. you'd have to be exceptionally brutal with kids like that in order to get them to even apply themselves, let alone pass. So that sort of brutality, would it even work? Would it achieve any? I'm sure they do better than if you didn't do it, but would they acquire a love of learning or anything like that? No. Now, in spite of the brutality there, these teachers were very focused on discovering any natural aptitude. Now, some of this was a hangover from the mass mobilization of World War II and indeed World War One. You've got an army of say in any country that's mass mobilizing, you've got an army of 200,000 or something, and that army now has to be 10 million. So you've suddenly, overnight, you've got to find 10 million. So how do you don't have the 750,000 sergeants, master sergeants that you need. You don't have all the captains and the majors and the lieutenants and so on. So or the soldiers for that matter. So you very quickly got to find these people. So you've got to look for natural aptitude. And there's just no time. You can't train people from the ground up, slowly and methodically over years. You need that army right now. And so one of the ways that the army or the armed forces generally, could be the Air Force, Navy, whatever, and one way they did this, which was through necessity, they may not have liked it, but it's through necessity, is they looked at natural aptitude. And so they would try and pick out, this guy's going to be good at, organizing logistics and support, and this guy's going to be good as a frontline officer, or, and so on and so forth. This guy's going to be good at, I don't know, a sniper or whatever, and so on. So they try and look for natural aptitude. Now, it wasn't the perfect way to do it, but they didn't have that option of chasing perfection. So they went about looking for natural aptitude. And this was something that was still around when I was a kid. You don't see it so much now, if at all. In fact, I don't recall I see it anywhere these days. But back then, there was a real push for natural aptitude. And nearly all the teachers, in some capacity at least, had served in the armed forces, and again in some capacity. So they all had this look for natural aptitude, drilled into them. So and because you did a variety of classes, there were I remember there was this kid who had this great singing voice. So they encouraged him to go into the choir and learn music. He got a lot of support too. And if he wanted to practice some sort of choral arrangement, I remember the teachers would say, "Well, I'll stay back after school or during lunch hour," and then they would go in and play the piano while he sang and help him out. So the teachers were actually quite dedicated. They weren't just brutal, and a couple of them maybe did get off on the brutality of it, but they were very dedicated in that regard. And or it could be anything. It didn't have to be music. It could be sports. It could be mathematics. It could be poetry. It could be anything. They were always looking for natural aptitude. And this one kid used to write these fantastic essays, and he had a super imagination. I wonder if he ever became a novelist or something like that. And he was encouraged in that pursuit. And some of his stuff was pretty good. I remember they'd get him to read it out in class. There's like a couple of pages, sort of short story type length, but so this sort of thing of discovering natural aptitude and then encouraging people to follow that. Again, I think that's gone. But coming back to the education sort of side of it, creating equal outcomes just through gifting people passes at junior high and high school and college, and gifting people masters and PhDs. But the idea of, if you've got a PhD that we gifted to you, that you're too stupid even to make it out of junior high school, but if we give you that PhD, you're just the same as that really, really bright white guy over there that worked really hard to get it. You're just, because you've both got a PhD, therefore you're the same. You're the same as him. Hey, look at the PhD, it's the same. So there's this attitude of equal outcomes, reflected in that now. But we see it in all areas, whether it be legal or otherwise. But back in the day, or back in this time, late 60s, early 70s, it was already an issue that people were complaining about. That why bring in these brown and black people that aren't really needed? and then hold them to a much lower standard than white people are held to, but give them white people's jobs. That was the concern, back in the day. This is, for example, in England. Now, there are other sort of things, other papers were floating around among right-wing type think tanks that were saying, well, if we bring in all these black and brown people, then they will break the power or dilute the power of the trade unions. And they rather missed the point. The trade unions have been infiltrated quite heavily by, Soviet communist agitators and that sort of thing. So rather than treat the trade unions as a partner in achieving, in England, say, or elsewhere, Australia, or economic growth and economic and business harmony, rather than trying to create that, it was a situation of direct confrontation, and each side wanting to break the other, to no benefit to anybody in the end. And so bringing in masses of black and brown people and putting women in the workforce was seen as one of the ways of diluting the power of the trade unions and undermining their capacity to engage in industrial warfare, in effect, which is what was going on in the 1960s. Not the management were without without blame in this. It was they certainly were. Each side used to be looked like they were itching for a punch up, but nonetheless. So this idea, again, just coming back to it, holding white people to a much higher standard, or white males rather, to a much higher standard, was already around in the late 60s, early 70s. It's now reached, insanity proportions, where there are quotas for all minorities, which and every minority person that gets a job is a job that's stolen. Let's call it what it is, stolen from straight white males. You've been a Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.